Okay, so here we are with part 4. I'm gonna make this one a lot shorter. That last video got way long. So I've already got the rear end pulled apart. The rear is much simpler. Basically you pull the tire, and then on a Samurai, the drum more or less acts like an adapter. The axle flange has only got these 4 bolts. So you pull the tire, pull these 4 bolts, and then the drum will come off. And then once the drum is off, you'll have access to these 4 bolts that go through this flange on the end of the axle. So you'll pull the 4 nuts off the back of this, and then the backing plate and the axle will come out together. And then once you have both sides, you have to pull the brake line loose from the wheel cylinder. That's the one downfall on the Samurai setup, is the backing plate has to come off with the axle shaft in stock form. And so you've got to pull your brake line. What I do is use these little vacuum caps that are for like intake manifolds. And I stick them on there, I have it ready, and I pull this off, and really quickly I stick these on so you don't lose a bunch of brake fluid. It makes the bleeding go a lot faster when you put it back together. So you get both sides apart, and then 4 bolts on the drive line, 8 bolts around the third member, and the third member comes out. You can have this whole thing apart in 20 minutes or something. It's a lot easier than the front. So for future use on this Samurai, and an upgrade I highly recommend is you switch to what's called the SJ410 retainer. So I'll show you, I have a spare axle for my car that's already set up. So it uses this small plate to hold the bearing in to the end of the tube instead of the backing plate. And then the backing plate is sandwiched in between these when it's assembled. But you cut a larger hole, which I should have grabbed that too. So these are spare parts for my car. But you disassemble this whole setup, so you got to pull the bearings off, which is kind of a bummer, but a good time to do it's when your wheel bearings are bad. You take a 3-inch hole saw, you cut this out, and then once you've got this installed on the new axle shaft, this will be here when it gets put back together. So in the future, if you need to pull an axle out again, this comes out and this stays. This will stay put on the axle, so then you don't have to disconnect your brakes. So there's like two big benefits. Maintenance down the road is much easier. If you've got to change a seal or change a wheel bearing or pull a diff out for whatever reason, you don't have to mess with the brakes and rebleeding. And a second, that's probably even a bigger benefit, is carrying spare axle shafts. Because if you were to carry spares with a stock setup, you've got to have a backing plate on it. So that's pretty hard to store inside your car. Whereas this is much more compact with just this little plate on here. When I'm doing King of the Hammers, or like the Rubicon Trail or something that's tough, I keep one of each side rear axle shafts in my car, and they basically just lay right in here. Obviously mine's different, but they don't take up hardly any space. So it's a really beneficial upgrade to do. And so while this is all apart, that's going to get done as well. So now that I've got this all apart, I'm going to get the rear diff on the bench and start pulling it apart. So hang on one sec. So we'll come back when we get this this diff case shredded and pulled all apart, and I'll show pulling the bearings and all that and putting in new stuff. Okay, so I got this flipped over. I pulled the pinion nut off. This is a 1 1/16. That's the size I use. It fits perfect. I'm not sure what the metric equivalency would be. So if you can see in the end, in the threads, there's like a kind of like a keyway notch. The rim of this nut gets hammered into that to be a locking feature. With a decent impact gun, it'll just tear it up and come out. Most setup kits come with a new nut, so you don't have to worry about that getting tore up. The end of the gear I've never seen get messed up, but if you're worried about it, you can take a center punch and drive it out, but I've never done that. I always just zip it off. You can kind of see right there is where it was, and it just opens it right back up. So now the flange is pretty tight on the splines, as well as the pinion is tight in the bearings. So what I do is take an air hammer, which is like a straight chisel tip or a punch, and drive the thing out of there. I'm gonna have to move this. My table's too springy, just absorbing the impacts. So I'm gonna put it down on a hard surface and I'll come back. Okay, so I got that apart. And what I actually did, the air hammer wasn't wanting to do it. So you take a ball peen hammer and put the ball end, it'll center up on the end of the pinion. There's a centering hole drilled in it. And then take a big hammer and use that to drive it out. I like this a lot better than trying to hold a punch because you're not going to smash your fingers, and the extra weight of this seems to work a lot better. Wear safety glasses. A lot of people say you should never hit a hammer on a hammer, but I don't know. I've done it about 5 million times and never had a problem. But wear safety glasses. So anyway, drive that through. Now we got the pinion out. This is called a crush sleeve. This basically, the other bearing is still in here, but with the, there's this tapered bearing, and then there's another one that sits up here. And when this gets installed in the case and you tighten that nut, this gets compressed, and it's made of sort of a springy steel, so it doesn't just bend, but it clamps against the inner race of this bearing and that bearing, and then against it basically sandwiches the head, the inner race, the inner race of this bearing, and the flange to lock all that stuff together, because the last thing you want is the inner races spinning on the shaft. So that's the job of this guy. If you're running bigger tires and running your axles really hard, they make a replacement for this that's a solid steel tube that's real thick and heavy, and it doesn't crush, and what it has is a selection of shims that you put in here instead. And that's a more secure setup. So basically with this setup, when you tighten that nut, you can over tighten it and over squish this and put too much preload on the bearings. Whereas with the solid spacer, you can, this won't move. And so you set that distance with the shims, and then you can torque that nut down a lot tighter, therefore putting more pressure on all these inner races to keep anything from spinning. So something to keep in mind. With this vehicle with 29-inch tires, we're just going to run this. But my Samurai, race use and 33s, I went with solid spacers front and rear on mine. So next, just gonna pry out this seal, and then once that seal is out, this bearing will fall out, and then these races will get driven out. So there's this one, and then there's one for that bearing as well. So I'm gonna get those out and I'll show you what it looks like. Okay, so to pull these seals, I'll typically just take a pry bar. You want to just catch it and then just kind of use the weight of everything. And just kind of bounce it, and then she'll pop right out. Now that that seal's out, the second bearing comes out, and you can see what I was trying to explain. So that's how that lives inside the case. All right, so now I'm going to drive these races out and get this all cleaned up and show you how I install the new races. Okay, so I got those races driven out. So basically all you need is a hammer and a long punch. They're already out, but you'll basically get this in there and you'll find the edge of, you know, with the case sitting this way, you're gonna be driving out this race. So you'll find the edge and just work your way back and forth, kind of in like a star pattern, because you don't want it to get cocked. You want to try to drive it as evenly as possible. And then for the larger inner race, you'll turn the case upside down and do the same thing. So once you've got those out, this thing's basically bare. There's no other parts that come out of it. So I'm going to get this super clean, and then we'll put the new races in, and then we'll get this bearing pulled off of here, and then you can kind of see it's hard to see, but there's shims in between the bearing race and the head of the pinion there. And those shims are real important. They got to go back. They got to stay with the pinion with the new bearing, because those control what's called the pinion depth. You know, as this sits in here, the height that this sits is real important for proper meshing of the teeth. And I think I've explained, but I'll say it again. If you're not changing your gear ratio and you're keeping your gears that you already had, you don't have to be afraid of like knowing how to set up gears to do a locker. Like I showed in the front diff, the only thing that's important is getting that bearing preload and the backlash. And that's really easy. And again, just a cheap dial indicator you can get at Harbor Freight or Amazon or something with a little magnetic base is all you need. So this is something that literally anybody could do as long as you got a decent selection of tools and, you know, basic mechanics knowledge. I'd say one of the biggest things is just cleanliness. You know, my workbench is a disaster, but when I go to put this together, I start over, clean everything off, and make sure this is 100% clean and all my parts are 100% clean, and just be very careful to keep any dirt or grime or, you know, anything out of this, especially, you know, out of the bearings. So that's basically it for disassembly. I'm going to get this clean and then we'll start putting it back together. Okay, one more quick thing I wanted to bring up. When you're taking all the parts out of this, if these races come out really easily, that's bad. Basically, they need to be a pretty tight fit, and like, I mean, it probably took, with that punch, working back and forth, probably took 20-30 hammer hits to knock those out. If they just slide out easy, that means something's happened and your race has spun in the case and basically wore that opening out. And if that's the case, I would not go any further with that case. I would find a new one, because if once that's spun once, it'll spin again. I've seen people try, they make like Loctite sleeve retainers and all this different stuff. None of that, in my opinion, really works long term. So that's something to watch out for. You want to make sure those races fit really tight. Okay, so I got the bearing removed off of the pinion, and this is the shim. You have to make sure this stays with the pinion when you install the new bearings. So I used a bearing splitter. You slide this together under the bearing, and then you can either put it in a shop press and push the pinion down, or what I did, the jack in my press is gone bad, so I don't have a press running right now. So I just basically did 2 blocks and then did the same 2 hammers trick to knock the pinion down. It comes out pretty easily. So I'm gonna get this cleaned up the rest of the way, and then I've got the same Sumo Gears differential kit. For this one, it comes with all of the bearings and the seals. Finger bolts. Oh, and popcorn. Anyway, I showed it in the other video, but it's the same kit. So I'm going to use everything in the kit this time, all the bearings, all the seals, ring gear bolts, everything. So really, besides the case and the gear set, I mean, this third member is going to be all brand new. All right, so let me get these bearings installed, and then I'll bring it back. Okay, so I got the new bearing pressed on to the pinion, the lower bearing there. So what I do is I take a piece of 1 3/4 120 wall tubing. It fits perfectly on the inner race, and then I can just knock it on with a hammer. You want to hit back and forth, like kind of the same thing in a star pattern, to make sure you drive that down straight. And then I put the new races in, both the inner and the outer. And when I do those, it's nice to use a brass punch to make sure you don't nick or scar that up in any way. The brass is soft, and you can see it will kind of contour to the shape instead of damaging the races. So now that that's done, I'm going to take, install this with the new crush sleeve, drop it in there, put the seal in first, and then put the pinion in, and basically put it all together and start torquing down the nut. And again, looking for the right, basically like drag. There's a very fine torque setting for how much force it takes to get this to turn. And when I get to that point, I'll let you know what that is. So let me get this all installed. Okay, so I've got the pinion fully installed. I put in a new seal, slid the new crush sleeve on, put the pinion up from the bottom, and then dropped on the flange, the washer, and the new nut. And then it takes a lot of torque to compress that crush sleeve. But what you got to do is just tighten it, feel it, tighten it, feel it. You want there to be, once you get to the point where there's no up and down movement, but it still rotates freely, then you really got to slow down and tighten it slowly, because what you're looking for is 7 to 14 inch-pounds of force it takes to get this to start turning. I use the same fishing scale. Basically do like that. You want to be 90 degrees to the pivot. From the center to that hole is about 1 3/4 inches. So you just do the math, but if it was 2 inches and you were at 14, that would be 7 inch-pounds. So Yeah, anyway. 7 to 14 inch-pounds. And that's it for the pinion. Now I'm gonna flip it over and get ready. Well, I guess first of all, I'm gonna leave this upright just so no dust out of the air or anything could fall. And usually what I'll do, if this is gonna sit for any kind of time, I'll put it in a new plastic bag, like a garbage bag or something. I'm just really nervous about dirt, so I always take as many precautions as possible to keep dirt out of new parts like this. So now the next thing is I'm going to get this second TE208 unboxed. Make sure I'm giving you the right number. Yep. So that's the 26 spline again, rear application Samurai differential. I'm going to get this set up with new bearings and then go through the same process we did with the front. I've got to get the hole drilled and tapped, and just get this guy done. So I'm probably not going to go through and show too much of that since it's an exact duplicate of what we've already done. As far as this goes, I am working with Tony Zepka of Zepka Customs. He is a US distributor for these guys. And we're getting the details worked out for a discount that can be used from a code that I'll have in my videos. And once that's set up, we're in the process right now of getting that all sorted out. I'm gonna put those codes in the descriptions for all the parts of this video series. So pay attention for that if you're in the market. If you're not aware, you know, these guys build stuff for, it's not just Suzuki's, you know, they cover the full range of vehicles. So give their site a look, TRE4x4USA.com. Check them out. Okay, so I got the rear all done, all put together. So if you're doing a regular Samurai housing, this seems to be a pretty nice spot. So I mean, this is the top. So you've got this little triangular area, and I basically try to center it between these two valleys, and then more or less centered between. So basically, you have an indent here, and then here and here, and I just shoot for the center of that triangle. You can see the inside. It keeps this nice and tucked out of the way, and it's not. Hopefully, it's offset enough to not be a direct oil spray off the ring gear. I mean, this thing is waterproof or whatever you want to call it. Once you tighten this guy up, I gotta do that still, but you can see the wire stays out of the way. It's not going to get caught in the teeth. So that's it. Got to get the rear housing cleaned out. I highly recommend Loctiting all of the hardware. I use blue with a medium strength. Yeah, so these 3 bolts, you know, obviously ring gear bolts, those are a must to be Loctited. And then these, I tend to put a little bit of oil on the threads of these spanner nuts when I'm building them, just to make them easier to turn when you're setting the bearing preload and the backlash. Yeah, these are just things that I do. And again, this little post is what keeps the electromagnet from rotating, and this bracket bridges this area and holds it, but it needs to have a little movement if you can hear that ticking. That way you know it's not being held in a bind. So far, this is the 3rd one I've done with this style magnet retainer, and they've all just worked great. I haven't had to touch them. It's not very thick, so there's still plenty of threads for this bolt. Yeah, that's really about it. Pretty simple to do. once you've done one or two of them and you get the hang of it, pretty easy. So I'm going to get this guy slammed in there, and then the next part of this video will be concentrating on just doing the wiring, getting the two diffs wired up and the switches mounted. The owner already chose, it's dark in there, but you can see in between the two dash vents, he mounted a piece of plastic right there. He wants the switches right there so they're in easy reach. So that's where I'm going to put them. And that's it. So thanks again for watching these videos. And if you have any questions or need any help or whatever, I'm always happy to help people. You know, I'm a big fan of do-it-yourself type stuff for myself and others. You know what I mean? So I like to share the knowledge I have, and you know, and learn from other people. And I hope that goes both ways. So hit me up if you have any questions or need some help, or maybe if you have suggestions, you're seeing something that I'm doing that's dumb, reach out. Let's make this a community, and let's get more people out in the dirt. So thanks again for watching.